with the research that I was doing, I was really looking at pathogen mitigation. So we were inoculating feed with some surrogate organisms and looking at how different steam conditioning temperatures and steam conditioning times, and quite honestly, some feed additives could help mitigate pathogens in the feed, which becomes really important as we move more and more towards antibiotic-free.
Welcome to the Poultry Podcast Show. Today I am here with John Boney. Welcome to the show, John.
Hey, thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Oh, awesome. So I'm excited to talk to you later about some other topics, but first I want to hear, how did you get into poultry?
Yeah, great question. It's an interesting story, one that's probably common for many folks. I left school with a passion for animal sciences and feeding the world. Thought that I wanted to be a veterinarian. Learned that there were other opportunities, such as grad school. Learned that I needed to get involved with a research lab. And so that was kind of my course of action when I went to West Virginia and got my undergraduate degree. I got involved with a research lab. Making the decision, I looked at protein consumption trends per capita here in the U.S., learned about the growing consumption of poultry, and that really kind of helped guide me and drive me into the poultry industry.
Birds are constantly threatened by the exposure of mycotoxins in their feed. Fumonisins are a highly prevalent mycotoxin that can impact health and performance. DSM-Firmenich offers a range of analytical services to assess mycotoxin contamination and solutions to combat mycotoxins. One of those solutions is FumeZyme, the only FDA-approved enzyme to combat fumonisins. Visit dsm.com/FumeZyme to learn more.
That seems very calculated. I like it.
Yeah, I left home with the goal of earning a reasonable salary and not having to do some of the hard labor that I see my family having to do, even up into their older ages. So
yeah. Well, you're definitely right on the per capita consumption. So your predictions of the upward trend were accurate.
That's right.
Kind of surprised you didn't become an economist or something else like that.
Yeah, maybe didn't have quite the background in math that I needed, so I stuck with poultry production and nutrition.
That's true. So how did you get to your current position after you graduated with your bachelor's degree? What happened?
So after my undergraduate degree, when I was involved with undergraduate research and involved with feed milling research, I had the opportunity to take that to the next level. Started managing the feed mill and was offered to go to graduate school, obtain my master's degree. So I really, and what I preach to my students is just I took advantage of an opportunity. So I tried to put in a lot of hard work, and that presented some opportunities, and I just took advantage of them. And that opportunity to manage the pilot feed mill at West Virginia University gave me the opportunity to work with not only folks in my own lab and in my own field, but with other graduate students and PIs across the animal industries that were being studied there at West Virginia. So it was a neat journey to get where I am. And I did that for 2 years, earned the master's degree. And because of the really specific training that I was getting and some really good mentorship opportunities through the American Feed Industry Association and West Virginia University, I had some mentors that encouraged me to pursue the PhD, take it to that next level. Because of that really specific training, there would be some neat opportunities for employment and neat career opportunities. So that's what I did. I once again capitalized on an opportunity, and that led me here to Penn State.
That's awesome. So was your master's in feed milling technology, or was it in a nutrition or like a combined program?
It was really a combined program, bridging the gap. So understanding how you could formulate a diet with maybe some novel ingredients and use the feed mill as a tool to help improve poultry performance.
Yeah,
So
that
it's
is really
really,
interesting.
yeah, bridging the gap is what we were doing.
Yeah. Yeah, very cool. So what was the focus of your PhD program after that? Sounds like you had some cool background to move on.
Yeah, in the master's degree, mostly on novel feed ingredient development and the impacts to production and pellet quality. When I moved into the PhD and got to be a little bit more creative with the research that I was doing, I was really looking at pathogen mitigation. So we were inoculating feed with some surrogate organisms and looking at how different steam conditioning temperatures and steam conditioning times and quite honestly, some feed additives could help mitigate pathogens in the feed, which becomes really important as we move more and more towards antibiotic-free and these other specialty type feeding programs where we have less tools in our toolbox, right? We want to do everything we can to minimize the pathogen load being introduced to these animals, and feed is one of those avenues.
Yeah, I think that's such a cool area because we forget that the feed itself could be a source. So I'm happy other people are working in that area because, tell you what, feed mill is super cool. I don't ever want to run one.
Very good. Yeah, it is a great opportunity, one that may be missed. But I do think that those mill guys understand this, and I think they're doing a good job. They're certainly interested in the results of that research and trying to use it to make decisions, especially when they're using some of those ingredients that may have a higher likelihood of having or containing a pathogen.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so you're currently in an assistant professor role. What are you doing for your research focus?
Yeah, so I started here in 2018. I have an extension appointment as well as a teaching appointment. So I don't really have a defined research appointment, but the cool thing about Penn State here is with the extension program, they strongly encourage an applied research program. So what I do is I work with our poultry industry here in Pennsylvania. We're identifying some of their needs. And we find creative ways, and we do research here to answer some of their very specific questions. So it's really fun. The industry's really engaged with us here. We have some great students that are being trained, and largely their training involves getting out in the field in Pennsylvania on poultry farms, giving them a really great background, a breadth of experience that positions them well for employment once they graduate.
Yeah, the on-farm experience is really important. I'm glad that you're training students in that aspect. Are your typical farms that are looking to you for guidance, are they more broiler focused or layer, or kind of a combination?
So we have a really diverse poultry industry here in Pennsylvania. So we pretty much have it all. We have caged layers, we have cage-free layers, but primarily I work on the meat bird side. So largely with conventional and organic broiler chicken production and heavily involved in the turkey production here in Pennsylvania.
Oh, very cool. It sounds like a nice combination.
Yeah, it works well.
So what are some of the projects that the producers have been interested in lately?
So I'll say my first project here had nothing to do with nutrition or feed milling, but that's extension. So we know that the questions are going to vary. And this was timely. This was related to the Global Animal Partnership, or GAP, lighting requirements for turkey poults. And there were some concerns about providing this continuous darkness from the day of hatch, which was a requirement of a GAP lighting program. So we went out and got to see these poults, fully appreciate their concerns that the producers had, and brought that back, and were able to work with one of the lighting outfits, and we renovated a barn, have some relevant lights, light systems, and we studied this, and we were able to report back to our producers here in Pennsylvania that although contrary to maybe what they believed, the bird that we're feeding now was able to successfully find feed, find water, get through that critical 3 or 4 day starve out period, even with that 6 hours of continuous darkness from the day of hatch. So it gave them a little bit more confidence that, all right, the bird that we're using and a program that we're using because of the decision to use GAP, these birds are able to grow, we're able to maintain early mortality, and they were very happy with that. Other things that we do, where I got most excited because it's in the field that I work, is looking at on-farm nutrient segregation. So understanding how feed quality can impact the presentation of feed and nutrients in front of the bird in the feed pans in the barns. And that has allowed me to take students to commercial feed mills and integrated feed mills across Pennsylvania and work with them to follow that feed into the house and fully appreciate how the emphasis or lack of emphasis on feed quality can really impact what's presented to the bird and ultimately impact how that bird performs.
Yeah. So what do you think about the role of, I'll just say pellet quality or crumble quality, since you said most of your work was in the meat bird? How is that impacting when you get on site, what it looks like when it arrives, and then when it gets to the end of that feed chain? Is that some of the area that you guys are interested in?
That's exactly what we're interested in. So we're following it from the feed mill. When we get here, we're looking at that feed before it's either blown or augured into the feed bins on site, following that into the house, following it into the hopper, and then following at various locations along the feed line. And we know that it does change, right? Of course it changes. The feed bin is really dynamic, and how those pellets and fines move through those feed bins is dynamic, and that tends to change day over day. We know that if you have to pull the feed a very long distance, so say that your feed bins are at the end of the barn, and the feed is pulled the entire length of the house, it's going to have a greater degree of impact on nutrient segregation than if the feed bins are located more centrally and augured shorter distances to either end of the house. That's all going to impact feed quality. And then we're also looking at the quality of the feed produced at the mill. So if you're starting with a lower feed quality, in this case I'm referring to the physical quality of the feed, starting with a lower feed quality, you're going to have a greater degree of segregation. At least that's what our research has pointed out. Whereas if you have more of a focus on physical feed quality, pellet quality, we tend to see a lesser degree of nutrient segregation or a more uniform presentation of feed in those feed pans along the feed lines.
So when you say feed quality coming from the mill, are you talking about the relative protein content, for example, of the corn or the soy that's coming in? Or is it more a uniform grind size before it goes into a pelleter? Or both of those things may be important?
Well, all of those are important. Really what we are looking at is we're trying to ensure that the feed that is presented to the bird represents that diet that was formulated by the nutritionist.
Yeah.
Right. So there are many steps along the way, many things that contribute to the overall quality of the feed. So in all of our research, we started with using feed mills that are routinely measuring the performance of their mixers. So we know that we're starting with a mixer that has a 5% CV or less in all the research we've done so far, because we want to start with a uniform feed that really represents that formulation that the nutritionist provided to the mill. This line of research could continue, and hopefully does continue for many years, where we can look at the impact of the mixture performance on this idea of nutrient segregation. But before we even got there, we wanted to fully appreciate what happens when you have a mixture that's performing well. We're mixing feed before it goes into the pellet mill that really represents that formulation that the nutritionist sent to the mill. So then we know that feed changes. There's been several papers that support this, and there are several reasons why it changes. There's the journey of the feed from the feed mill on the truck. It has to be augured from the truck into a bin. It then moves through that bin, and then it has to move down the line, the feed line that may differ in length. And all of those different facets of transport can impact the physical presentation of that feed. And
Yeah.
so that's what we're trying to tease out those differences in our lab, fully appreciating that throughput demands drive this industry. We know that at the end of the day, we have to provide feed to the birds. However, hopefully our research is giving folks another reason to really think about pellet quality, think about feed quality, and maybe consider investing in feed quality improvements I think we'll get into some of the results later, but at the end of the day, this can impact the performance of the bird.
Yeah. So what are some of the biggest variables or indicators that you look for that would be initial suggestions maybe for improvement? Is it just, does the pellet hold up to all this travel, or is it starting all the way back at what is the tolerance for your CVs for mixing? Maybe it's all of it.
Yeah, I think so that we have time to get through everything, I think I'll just say at the beginning of this, when we first started down this road and I decided to put a lot of effort into understanding feed flow and nutrient segregation, we said we need to identify a marker. What is the best nutrient segregation marker? And in a perfect world, that would be something that we could maybe achieve with NIR, because it would be rapid, it would be relatively cheap. And so we explored that a bit, and that has not really lended itself well to identifying a nutrient segregation marker. Crude protein, there was too much variability there. We were not able to use that as a good marker. So then we looked at other things. We started measuring amino acids. So we looked at 12 different amino acids. We looked at phytase activity. We did some wet chem and looked at all of the proximates, et cetera. You can use other feed additives as well. And what we found is that phytase activity, if you measure phytase activity, we can certainly pick up differences in the house. But being able to pick up a difference and actually having something that impacts the bird can be two different things. So then we had to verify, is phytase activity a good segregation marker? Same thing with amino acids. We were able to pick up differences in amino acids in various regions of this house. But once again, the question was, are those differences significant enough to impact performance of the flock? So that's what several of my students have done as part of their master's research, is doing little parts of that. So if we look at the first experiment that we ran, we had 4 different scenarios. We looked at 2 pellet qualities, what I would call standard for the industry, I think would be our lower feed quality. And then we looked at something where we had a really big focus on improving feed quality. So we got up to about 80% pellet in the house. And I think that is something that can be achievable in some cases. So we had the 2 feed qualities, and then we had those 2 feed line lengths. And that was, once again, whether the bin was located at the end of the house or more centrally located. So we're trying to understand, does the length of the feed line impact segregation and our ability to pick it up? So we had that. We filled feed lines. We worked with the commercial mill here in Pennsylvania, creating the 2 different feed qualities. And once we filled the feed lines, we actually went through and collected feed from every feed pan in these houses. So we did this in a replicated manner. It took an incredible amount of time and effort. We had over 3,000 feed samples that we handled. We looked at the pellet to fine ratio. We scanned for proximate analysis. Select samples we used for wet chem and also for phytase activity analysis to really get a good picture of what's happening in the house. And we had those 4 replicate feed lines to try to appreciate feed flow in the house. And we found kind of the best case and worst case scenarios, best case being a high feed quality or the improved feed quality in those shorter feed lines. And when we were able to move feed, that high quality feed shorter distances, we eliminated nutrient segregation.
Oh, wow.
So that feed was uniform. At least all of the variables that we measured did not differ statistically. So it was a uniform presentation of feed to all those birds in that that we're eating off of that feed line. Whereas in our worst case scenario, the poor feed quality, or maybe standard feed quality, if you will, in those long feed lines, we had 6 of the 12 amino acid concentrations varied along that feed line. Our phytase activity differed, and it actually differed. It was about 70% different in different regions of the house. So we had this incredible amount of phytase activity variation along these long feed lines. And we thought, wow, that's incredible to, one, pick that up, but two, perhaps we've just identified this great nutrient segregation marker.
Yeah.
So we decided, all right, let's take what we learned in the field and let's bring it back to the university and try to feed birds in a similar manner in replicated pens to try to tease out, will this impact the bird?
Yeah.
And so that's what a couple of my students have been doing with their time.
Yeah. So what have you done? I know you said you do some of the phytase work was done commercially, and then you brought it to the research level. Have you added to that story? Do you think it should be used as a biomarker, or what else can you tell us about that? That's super interesting.
Yeah. So it would be nice if I could tell you that phytase activity was this great nutrient segregation marker. But what I found, we brought this back to the university. We designed we incorporated the phytase activity differences from the field, as well as those amino acid differences that we saw in the field. So we had a 10% difference in amino acid concentration. So we went with breeder recommendation levels, and we dropped it 10% to represent the 10% difference that we saw in the house. And then we also formulated for a standard dose of phytase at 500 units. And we created a basal diet, but we withheld phytase. So then we added phytase to that basal diet with this reduced NPP at 3 different levels, 250, 500, and 750 FTUs of phytase per kilogram of feed. So that was our 6 treatments that we studied. And what we found at the end of the day, that phytase activity variability had no impact on the performance of our birds. And we looked at feed intake, live weight gain, we looked at body weights, we even looked at bone mineralization. So we looked at tibia ash, we looked at the milligrams of tibia ash per kilogram of body weight so that we could compare that back to the actual size of the bird. And we followed it into the processing plant and looked at breast yield, wing yield, thigh yields, etc. At the end of the day, at least in this scenario, with the standard dose of phytase using breeder recommended levels of phosphorus and calcium, we were not able to pick up any performance differences. And I think the research supports that, right? If we think about those birds being able to consume phosphorus or phytase to liberate phosphorus from the diet over long periods of time, long periods at least throughout grow out, they were able to take up enough phosphorus as they grew over time that they were not at a deficient level, at least not at a level that impacted performance that we could pick up. But what was interesting here was the amino acid density work, just as anybody would assume. If you vary amino acid concentrations by that 10%, we went 105% of breeder recommendations and 95% of breeder recommendations. So that was our spread. And of course, when you feed them a more amino acid dense diet, they had body weights that were improved by about 170 grams a bird. We had a 6-point feed conversion ratio benefit to the bird when they had this addition of amino acids, which we would expect, right? That's what all of the amino acid research suggests. But the important part, bringing this all together, is that phytase activity, at least in the work that we found, might not be a great marker of nutrient segregation, but our amino acid concentrations are. And that can be good or bad. Amino acid analysis have an expense. It's not something that you can do in-house in most cases. Most of the time you have to send it off to a lab. But if it's something of interest, if nutrient or the presentation of nutrients to birds in the house is something that folks are interested in, I would recommend that they consider looking at amino acids.
So could you fairly well connect back maybe some variability in the flock due to maybe a bird preference on the feed chain, depending on the style of feed chain where the bin is? I mean, are we seeing flocks that have more variability maybe because of these feed quality issues, or are there maybe too many variables there to make that connection? But I just wonder about flock variability and just a basic thing of where is the bin and where does that bird prefer to go in the barn?
Yeah, and that's part of the bigger picture, right? So folks may say, well, why am I going to invest this time and energy in chasing down 6 points of feed conversion at the expense of the efforts it takes to improve feed quality? But if we really bring it back to flock uniformity and why that's important as we move to more automated more automated processing facilities, bird processing facilities, and the need for a uniform bird, certainly we can look to the flock for this. So what our next round of research and what we just wrapped up, hoping to get this out for review to be published soon, is we looked at nutrient segregation and the impact to the flock uniformity over time. We did this on farm. So we used a barn in Pennsylvania that has some hanging scales that also uses migration fences as part of their standard management practices. So birds are limited to where they can be in the house for obvious reasons. And so we have hanging scale bird weight data. We get about 3,000 data points a day from each of those segments of the barn. And we can track that feed quality, and we did track that feed quality over a 5-day period and the finisher period. And we see that the birds closer to the feed hopper, where the feed comes into the barn, being provided a feed that has more fines or less pellets, so a lower pellet to fine ratio. And as you move further and further away from that feed bin, the pellets kind of sift down through, segregate out, and you have more pellets at the end of the house. And so those birds, we were seeing sizable, significant improvements in birds in different parts of the barn. And I'll say where this becomes a challenge, and one of the nuances, and these are things that we have to talk to producers about. In those barns where we don't use migration fences, especially in summer grow outs when there's a preference to be closer to that fresh air coming into the barn, we oftentimes have we have more birds at that end of the house, and more competition for feed. So there are more and more birds that are left with the fines in the feed pans. We have less birds at the end of the house that are trying to, because of their desire to be up near the fresh air coming in. So you might not see those bird differences. They might not be as obvious or noticeable if you're not using migration fences, just because of where the birds are in the house. So it's definitely dynamic. But I think if in a perfect world where we can keep the same number of birds in each segment of the barn so that there's equal competition at feeders, you can see differences in performance of birds in different areas of the house.
Yeah. So I have a question about the issue with fines, and I have some different ideas of what the issue is. But I think of fines as, I love Lucky Charms. I think of fines as the junk at the end of the box that you don't want floating on your cereal. Like, it's kind of like, sticky. It doesn't really, it's not the stuff that you want. You want the actual pieces and the marshmallows. So is the issue with fines a texture sort of thing like that would be, or is it combined with it is, some different component of the feed that is getting, broken down, and the issue is that it's not a complete feed, if you will, that, it's the segregation, or so is it texture, segregation, or both?
Yeah, great question, and that's complicated. And I'll say that It can be a complete feed, right? So part of our work is we did separate pellets and fines and look at the nutrient composition of pellets and fines separately. And it depends on the setup of the feed mill, right? What is their enzyme addition strategy? Are they doing? Are they adding enzymes at the mixture, or are they adding some post pellet? And what's their fat addition strategy? All of these things can impact what's in those fines. So what we found is, of course, if you apply phytase post pelleting, there is a greater likelihood that as that feed moves longer distances, it can slough off, and you can actually have a higher concentration of phytase in the fines compared to the pellets. So you have that to contend with. If you are applying or a large portion of the fat or oil, whatever your energy source is, post pelleting, you can have a difference in the energy profile or the crude fat of the feed pans along the feed line. So there is some variation there. We're still chasing down what that means and if that really contributes to differences in performance. And it's part of the research that we're doing now. As far as texture goes, the birds do have a preference for these larger particles, right? If you give them the opportunity to eat pellets or fines, in most cases, as long as those pellets aren't super hard and where they can't actually break them up a little bit, in most cases, they will prefer that pellet. So they will. That's just their preference. They have really great eyesight and they can see those large particles, and that tends to be what they go for. And we've seen this for decades. The literature supports that. So I think that that's why we see the birds consume those pellets when they drop into the fines first, perhaps leaving the fines for the less dominant birds to consume later.
Yeah. Those less dominant birds don't even know what they're missing because they never get to see it.
That's right. That's right. Especially if they're down on the end of the house near where the feed comes in. A lot of the times that's ground up pretty badly.
Oh, yeah. I would have thought the opposite with damage for the chain and whatnot, but I see exactly how most of the fines could be concentrated there because the chain wouldn't pull it down to the others.
Yeah. And I think that makes a lot of sense, right? The drop down tube where the feed drops in, as we continue to pull more fines and pellets over top of that, the vibrations of the feed line working, the auger working, moves those fines down through the pellets, and that's why we tend to see that slug of fines early in the house. Yeah.
Stuff you don't think about till you have to think about it.
Yeah, that's right.
Is there anything else that we didn't cover today that you feel is important to say before we get to our last three questions?
I just want to conclude with we're now looking into what happens over time. So the first work that we did, that's out, that's published, and that really just looked at a snapshot in time. And I want folks to know we had to start there. We had to benchmark with one snapshot in time. We're now into barns. We're assessing this over time as the birds consume this feed to get a better appreciation for the impacts to the birds. So we don't have all the answers yet. Do know that it is in process.
Yeah, that sounds really exciting. I'll have to look for that.
It's time for our famous three. Your partner in improving animal performance, Berg & Schmidt. They believe the following additives are necessary in the poultry dietary. Functional lipids for an efficient dietary energy management. Phospholipids for emulsification, achieving a better nutrient intake. MCTs to provide energy and modulate the microflora within the intestines and enzymes for elevated use of fibrous materials and byproducts.
So I want to end the podcast today with the three questions that we ask all of the guests. And the first question is, what is your favorite poultry-related resource?
Yeah, so poultry-specific resource would probably be the Commercial Poultry Nutrition textbook. And I use that in many of my lectures and also help guide graduate students with that textbook as well.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion. What year was that book written in? Is there a recent update?
I'm not using the most recent update, and I don't have it right here on me, but it's been used for many years by many of the poultry nutritionists.
Yeah. I always like to know the reference year because the genetics companies update their requirements frequently, and I know that doesn't always make it into the kind of the bigger picture books and whatnot, but also the nutritionists who actually feed also feed a little differently than those requirements. So I always like to know what year people's sources are from. So super interesting. The second question is, what is a favorite non-poultry related resource?
Yeah, so I think non-poultry related resource is it's a very short book. It's called Elements of Style, and it is a writing resource. And I am an instructor, and I have resident education classes that I teach here, and the writing or ability of our students to write could use some work, and that's a textbook that I always refer them to take them back to the basics. And I think it's important that we communicate effectively.
Yeah, I 100% agree. That's a great one. The last question is, for somebody that wants to get into the poultry industry, what is your best advice for them to be successful?
So I think the best advice I would give them is to fully embrace the industry, appreciate the importance of the industry in feeding our growing global population. It's really incredible what people in our field can do and continue to do. So I think having an appreciation for where the industry was, where it is now, and having some vision for where we can go. I think feeding the world is really a noble cause, and I just want folks to really appreciate what the industry is and what it means to many of our families that rely on us. And the best advice I always give is you got to work hard, and I think that if you work hard, you'll separate yourself from the others pretty quickly.
You'll separate yourself from the fines, huh? Yeah.
There you go.
I do have one more question, which is unrelated to most of everything we've talked about. Do you have a name for your chicken anatomy model?
In the back, yeah, that is Brenda.
Brenda!
That is Brenda. And I'll have to say that I had a graduate student, a young man, and he had an alter ego. And when that would come out, we called him Brenda. And once he graduated, about the same time the chicken came in, I said, that's got to be Brenda.
That is great. I really appreciate that. So. Well, thank you for chatting today. I always learn a lot from our guests, and you were no exception, so I can have a better appreciation for some of the variability that can occur now in manufacturing and feed lines. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
You're welcome. Enjoy the rest of your day.